All right, welcome to The Explainer, where we break down big ideas. Today, we're diving into a really radical hypothesis about why we became human, and it's a story that starts not with strength, but with weakness.
So, let's kick things off with a puzzle. Genetically, we share over 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. That's a tiny, tiny difference. But just look at the world around us. Look at our cities, our art, our technology. The gap between our two species feels infinite, doesn't it?
So what gives? I mean, that tiny little genetic gap can't possibly be the whole story. It can't explain the profound differences in our bodies and our minds. So if it's not our nature, it has to be our nurture. But you have to ask, what kind of nurturing environment could have had such a powerful species-altering effect?
To get to the bottom of this, we need to completely flip the script on how we usually think about human evolution. See, the key to our uniqueness isn't found in some heroic march of progress. Nope. It's found in a profound, multi-million-year period of being weak, vulnerable, and totally isolated.
And this is where we get to the core idea, the 10 million-year solitude hypothesis. It proposes that everything that makes us unique, our upright bodies, our big brains, is really just the accidental byproduct of being trapped. Our evolutionary story, then, isn't one of conquest, but of confinement.
You really have to erase that classic image of the heroic caveman with a spear. The truth is, our ancestors stood just over a meter tall. They weren't the mighty hunters, they were the hunted. They were on the menu for giant saber-toothed cats, massive hyenas, and crocodiles. They were, in a word, fragile.
So, the stage for this long solitude was set by one of the biggest geological events on the planet. Around 10 million years ago, the African continent literally began to tear itself apart, forming the Great Rift Valley. Now, if you were a big, powerful animal, this was just some new terrain. But for our small, weak ancestors, these new cliffs and vast, dry plains were an insurmountable wall. They were trapped on the eastern side, cut off for good from their cousins in the western rainforests.
So what was this inescapable prison like? Well, far from being some barren wasteland, the hypothesis suggests it was a bizarre world unlike any other on Earth, a deep, submerged forest.
And this is how it all went down. Their forest home, which was in a basin, slowly started to flood. Over millennia, the ground became a permanent swamp, with water rising to their waists and then to their chests. In that situation, what do? To breathe, to simply survive, you have no choice but to stand upright. And the water's buoyancy actually supported their weak frames, making this whole new posture possible. It wasn't a choice to walk, it was a physical necessity to breathe.
And this is the crucial point, right here. Our ancestors were not brave explorers of some new aquatic frontier. No way. They were simply clinging to the treetops of their familiar home as the world literally changed underneath them. The water rose, and they were forced to adapt or drown.
And here's the key. This water world was a safe haven from large predators who, didn't really like deep water. But it also became a kind of gilded cage. For millions of years, their bodies became so hyper-specialized for this life, in the water, in the trees, that they simply couldn't survive on the dry, open savanna. They were locked in.
So, this long, passive incubation created our unique bodies. But our bodies are really only half the story. What about our minds? What sparked the birth of language and all that complex thought? Well, that required a second, very different kind of leap.
Now, what's so fascinating here is the incredible contrast between the two great leaps that define us. Our unique bodies were forged passively over millions of years by a slow, creeping geological change. But our unique minds were sparked actively in the fire of a sudden global catastrophe.
That catastrophe was the Toba supereruption. We're talking around 74,000 years ago. This massive volcano exploded, plunging the entire planet into a volcanic winter that lasted for years. This was, make no mistake, an extinction-level event.
The human population crashed to just a few thousand individuals, worldwide. In this desperate bottleneck, survival was impossible alone. You had to cooperate, to plan, to share complex information about where to find the last scraps of food. This intense pressure was the trigger. It forced us to go beyond simple warning calls and invent grammar, the ability to combine words to create infinite new meanings. This was the moment we went from being passive products of our environment to active problem solvers.
Now, this pattern, a small, weak group surviving against the odds by finding an isolated refuge, this isn't just a one-time event in our deep past. In fact, it seems to be a fundamental rule of survival, a kind of rhyme that just echoes throughout history.
And this idea just captures it beautifully, doesn't it? It's not about history repeating exactly, but about the underlying patterns of isolation and refuge rhyming again and again on different scales.
And this illustrates that pattern perfectly. On the macro scale, our entire species was born because our ancestors were trapped in the island of East Africa. Now, let's zoom into the micro scale. Much later, a specific genetic lineage known as haplogroup D only survived because it ended up in these geographical dead ends, places like the islands of Japan and the high plateau of Tibet. As a new wave of humanity expanded across Asia, this group survived not by winning a fight, but by being safely isolated in a refuge.
So, the crucial point here is that evolution's winners aren't always the strongest, the fastest, or the smartest. Sometimes they're simply the ones who, by pure chance, ended up in the right shelter at the right time. They survived not because they won the fight, but because they were in a place where no fight could even reach them.
And that leaves us with a final and pretty humbling thought. Our species, with all its art, science, and complexity, maybe we weren't the pinnacle of some purposeful evolutionary ladder. Maybe we are just the beautiful, intricate, and entirely accidental product of being small, weak, and trapped for a very, very long time. That's all for this explainer.
Today, we're jumping into what might be the coldest case of all time, our own origin story. We're going to unpack a pretty radical new theory that says everything we think we know about our evolution might be wrong, that we're not the product of some heroic struggle, but of a massive geological accident and millions of years of just complete and total solitude. So let's start with this central mystery, the big puzzle. Genetically, our blueprint is almost identical to a chimpanzee's. We're talking over 99% the same. So what in the world accounts for that tiny difference making, well, us? You know, everything from walking upright to building cities and sending robots to Mars. The answer, it turns out, might not be in our genes at all.
And that right there, that's our first clue. If it's not our biology, our built-in hardware, then it has to be something else. It has to be our environment, our upbringing. It's a tale of two very, very different childhoods for two nearly identical cousins.
Okay, so think of it like this. If the computer hardware is pretty much the same, then the difference has to be the software, the operating system that was installed by the environment over millions and millions of years. Our ancestors and the chimp's ancestors, they started with the same basic code. But geology was about to grab one of those groups and dump it into a completely new, isolated program.
This is where the story really gets going. Not with some big bang, but with the slow, relentless tearing apart of a continent. The scene of the crime, you could say, is Africa's Great Rift Valley. So picture this. 10 million years ago, there's this huge, continuous forest stretching across Africa, and our shared ancestors are just living their lives in it. But then, the Earth itself starts to split open. The Great Rift Valley begins to form, creating this massive barrier that slowly but surely splits that population in two. And by about 7 million years ago, that's it. The split is permanent. They can't get back to each other. Now you have to remember who we were back then. We were not the kings of the jungle, not even close. We were small, maybe a meter tall, kind of weak, and we were definitely on the menu for a lot of other animals. So for a creature like that, this huge, dry, exposed valley full of predators wasn't some fun challenge. It was basically a wall of death. The group on the eastern side was completely and utterly trapped.
But here's where the story takes a really weird turn. The place they were trapped in wasn't the open savannas you see in all the documentaries. It was something way stranger. A place they didn't choose but were basically forced to adapt to. A watery prison.
This quote really hits the nail on the head. It's a huge shift in how we think about this. Our ancestors didn't bravely decide to go live by the water. No way. Instead, the ground literally sank, and the forest they were living in just slowly flooded. The water rose around them, year after year, century after century. They weren't heroes. They were just passive victims of a changing planet.
But crazily enough, this prison came with some incredible, totally accidental benefits. The deep water was like a natural moat, keeping the big, scary predators away. The water's buoyancy helped support their body weight, so it wasn't as hard to stand up. It was also like a built-in air conditioner against the hot African sun. And here's the kicker.
To get around in chest-deep water and not drown, you have no choice but to stand upright. Walking on two legs wasn't some brilliant idea. It was something they had to do to survive.
And this brings us to the absolute core of this whole theory. This bizarre adaptation was only able to stick around and become permanent because of one thing: immense, crushing, inescapable isolation.
So let's put a name on it: the solitude hypothesis. The basic idea is that our unique human traits weren't the result of competing with other apes. Instead, they were cooked up in a kind of pure culture incubator, an ecological island where, for millions of years, our ancestors had zero contact, zero genetic mixing with any other group out there. This total solitude was the secret sauce. It meant that this new, really weird adaptation, walking on two legs, didn't get watered down or erased by mixing with the much larger ape population over on the other side of the valley. This isolation is what allowed our unique hardware, our bipedal body, to be forged and perfected over millions of years.
All right, so the hardware is complete. Our bodies are built. But the story's not over, not by a long shot. This is the moment our species gets a revolutionary software upgrade, one that would literally change the face of the planet.
And what triggered it? A global catastrophe. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano in what is now Indonesia erupted, and it plunged the entire world into a volcanic winter that went on for years.
I mean, for our ancestors, this was the apocalypse. The climate went haywire and the human population just plummeted. Some scientists think as few as 10,000 individuals survived across the entire globe. We were hanging on by a thread.
And this is where it all clicks into place. We had the hardware, that body, built for walking, forged in millions of years of solitude. But the Toba crisis forced a software upgrade. To survive something like that, we needed a brand new tool: complex grammar-based language. The ability to actually communicate complicated ideas. Like, hey, let's work together to hunt those last few animals over that hill tomorrow morning. That was the game changer. It was the software of cooperation running on the hardware of isolation.
Now, here's the part that is truly mind-blowing. This whole pattern, survival through isolation in a refuge, it's not a one-time thing. It's a theme that echoes through our entire history. It's like a strange rhyme that just keeps repeating.
Just think back to where we started. Our entire species, our unique body, was born in a refuge, right? An ecological island in East Africa that protected us and let us become, well, human.
Okay, now check this out. There's a group called Haplogroup D. They represent one of the very first waves of modern humans to leave Africa. They spread all across Eurasia, but look where we find their descendants today. It's only in the most isolated, hard-to-reach places on Earth: the high Tibetan Plateau, the far-off Andaman Islands, and the islands of Japan. Everywhere else, they were eventually wiped out or absorbed by bigger groups that came later. And there it is. That's the echo, the historical rhyme. Just like our species was first born in an African refuge, our oldest human lineages only survived by finding their own refuges, mountain fortresses, and isolated islands, escaping the pressure from everyone who came after. It seems that for us, survival is always about finding a safe place to hide.
So what does all this mean? This solitude hypothesis, it completely reframes our story. It's not a heroic march of progress. It's a story of geological accidents, lucky breaks, and survival in lonely places. We weren't the chosen ones. We were the lonely survivors of a forgotten prison. And if our intelligence, our bodies, our entire existence is just an unintended side effect of a continent tearing itself in two, well, that leaves us with a pretty deep question to think about, doesn't it?